this year, and hopefully the tables will be turned on them. Water everywhere. Today was one example of that, and in fact, just as we were coming into this forum, there was a flash flood warning, so this subject could not be more topical than it is. We have a great panel tonight to talk about this. Immediately to my left is Frank Greenland, the director of the Watershed Program of the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. Further down the table, Janine Rybka, the director of the Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District. And to the far end of the table, Mike Summers, the mayor of the city of Lakewood, and probably someone that you all know and have talked to before. They will introduce themselves to you in greater detail in just a minute. After the panelists make their presentations and discuss the issues, and I will turn it over to them and then throw out some questions to them. There will also be an opportunity for those of you in the audience to submit questions. There are already questions coming in. This is like early voting. There's already questions before we've even begun, and if they are not answered in the course of the discussion, then we'll get to at least some of those questions. So I'm going to first turn to Frank, who hopefully will give us a brief history of the consent decree that governs this topic and sort of give us an update on where we are as of today in terms of wastewater, in terms of the sewer district, and in terms of the region. Frank?
Okay. I'm Frank Greenland. I've been with the sewer district for 31 years now. So my whole career has been devoted to wet weather issues. And when it rains, we have problems. It can be in your basement, it could be at the treatment plant, overflows. So the major drivers in water quality, which have spawned the major initiatives of the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, focus on treatment plants, the wastewater treatment plants, their ability to treat flows during wet weather and have enough capacity to do so to provide full treatment. We, like Lakewood, have combined sewer systems. They overflow to the environment. We have a consent decree with the federal government that memorializes the terms and projects and schedules for the district's program to reduce combined sewer overflow discharges. And when we started the consent decree process, we were at about 4.5 billion gallons of combined sewer overflow discharge on an annual basis. We're getting very close to shaving 1 billion gallons off with the projects we've undertaken to date, and the project rolls on. So this is a federal consent decree. We're constructing large tunnels to drop overflows into the tunnel instead of the waterway. Tunnels hold those overflows. Those stored flows go to the treatment plant for full treatment. So that's a huge environmental gain. The other major, two big issues I wanted to touch on is infrastructure management in general. You know how the rains have been. They've been very spiky. They are a bit different. We get a lot of rain in a short period of time. Your sewers and most of our member community sewers were designed a long time ago. And so because of age of the infrastructure, design standards of a previous era, rainfall patterns of the present era, we have a lot of issues, overflows from sewer systems and or basement flooding issues, and we're continuing to try and attack those. One big step the district has taken is implementing a regional stormwater management program. When you look at the Rocky River, Lake Erie, any stream, in terms of water quality stressors on those streams, pollutants, and where they're coming from places like non-point source runoff. Some areas, the farms, and that's the western Lake Erie issue. They can be runoff from your lawns, can be overflows from sewer systems, treatment plant discharges, but stormwater runoff is not pure, especially in an urban environment. So we're tackling the issues both from a water quantity and a water quality perspective that stormwater poses on the region. And when your community floods because of stormwater issues, it's not good for the sanitary sewer site as well. So we have implemented a program, and that program's rolling quite well for us.
We will get back to some of the issues involved in the consent decree, the costs and whatever, as we move on. But I want to ask Janine Rybka if you could kind of give us an overview from your perspective as to where the county is currently and what challenges face us.
Okay, I'm Jan Ripka. I work with the Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District. I've been in my position for 18 years, and prior to that, I was the Public Involvement Coordinator for the Cuyahoga River Remedial Action Plan. So about 28 years in the environmental field, really focusing on education related to pollution prevention towards a goal of good water quality. And of course, this being the 50th anniversary since the last river fire, we have come a long way. And it is because of people like you in this room that we've reached out to over the years. You know, we have the big guys, a sewer district, and those in the initial years after the Clean Water Act, it was, you know, the point source polluters, the wastewater treatment plants, big industry that was targeted. And as Frank mentioned, now it is, you know, all of us, because as clean as all those pipes and the water treatment plants can get our water, there's still all that water running off the land, that storm water that runs into the storm drains that go directly to the river or Lake Erie, with the exception in the older combined sewer areas, and it works fine, except when you have these flashy rainstorms like today, and those systems are meant to, it's like anything else, it can only hold so much water, and when that gets filled, it has to outlet, and so that means everything goes out into the waterways. So as a county, over the last, you know, I'll say 30 years, we have seen a lot of improvements. We've seen a river where was really lacking in fish and the macroinvertebrates and the very small bugs and aquatic life, and we've seen that restored. We've seen public access to the river. Stormwater management's always going to be an issue, but if we can get people to individually in their own home, because, you know, we can think globally, but it's acting locally, because it can be very overwhelming to try to solve the problems of the county. So it is one step at a time of us doing our part. So I think with the, in 2003, when the second phase, the National Pollutant Elimination Discharge System came online, and that targeted the stormwater runoff, and communities like Lakewood and I believe 53 other communities in Cuyahoga County alone they fall under the mandate, and they are expected to, they are required to implement a stormwater management program that includes public involvement and public education, and illicit discharge detection elimination, erosion and sediment control, post-construction stormwater management, and good housekeeping pollution prevention. So it is a comprehensive program, with education always being the foundation and interwoven with those other minimum control measures. So our agency does the public involvement and public education for communities like Lakewood and the erosion and sediment control. And by that I mean, when you see construction sites and you see things like those dandy bags on the storm drains and the perimeter controls, that's meant to keep the pollutants and the soil on that site and not wash out in the storm drains. So all the cities that fall under that mandate are required to implement this program. Some may do it better than others. Lakewood's doing a stellar job. They have a great city engineer, and it falls to the leadership too, to make sure that those programs are being implemented and followed up and enforced as well. So I think we're seeing a lot of improvements. It's going to be a continuous effort on everybody's part.
Since you've mentioned Lakewood, I guess it's logical then to turn to the mayor and ask, what are the particular issues that are facing Lakewood? And you might want to talk more generally about the west side of Cleveland, but particularly Lakewood, what are the issues as we're sitting here now and going forward?
So if we had awakened on January 1st, 2006, we would be looking at a sewer system that collected pretty close to 79% of all waters and captured it in a rainstorm and then passed it through to our plant and treated it under all conditions, 79%. So that means 21% were not being captured and treated. And that's actually a pretty big number. Over 100 million gallons would be discharged into the watershed, mostly into Lake Erie through a culvert that goes underneath Lakewood and discharges about a quarter mile outside Webb Road under the lake. Lakewood has a wonderful opportunity to benefit from its geography of being high on a bluff. And the south end of Lakewood is 55 feet higher than the north end. So we have a total, gravity is our friend in Lakewood. We love Newton, we love gravity. So a drop of water anywhere in Lakewood can move all the way through our system, get to our plant without a single pump. That's actually a big deal in terms of how you manage these things. So we have this fantastic system that was designed and built in 1910, 20s, and 30s. It performs admirably as designed. However, starting in 1972, it became an illegal system. And cities all over the country, like Lakewood, were challenged to figure out how they could move that capture and treat percentage to, the goal would be 100%. In Lakewood's case, that we're shooting in the near term for 96%. And so what we've done is we've been able to make about $60 million worth of investments. That puts us at this moment in time at about 85% capture and treat. We have another $23 million that's been funded and approved. And if you were to go down to our wastewater treatment plant, you would see this enormous excavation going on. And that is a high-grade treatment facility, new technology. And that's one of the points that we want to think about is how technology is our friend and how it emerges in ways that weren't imagined 20 years ago, certainly not 100 years ago, and that we want to be in a position to use those technologies. But that investment coming online in about 2022 will put us at about 88% capture and treat. And we've identified an additional $50 million in investments beyond that that will, through 2 additional projects, that will put us at about 94, 95% capture and treat. So the challenge for Lakewood is the engineering that determined all that. That's a huge piece, one we have to absolutely hit bullseyes. The funding of how we fund what is fundamentally $75 million, counting the $25 million that's already in place, plus the additional 50. Who's going to pay that? What that impact is on the households of Lakewood. And then making sure we have the regulatory approval to keep going and the authority to do so, and the flexibility to make adjustments as we understand they may be needed by the engineering that will come upon us. And we're in a battle, I would say a negotiation. Frank, you know these terms better than I, with the US EPA and the Ohio EPA, who are the prime regulators here, who are charged with enforcing the Clean Water Act. Their partners are the Attorney General's offices of each of the state of Ohio and the United States. And they are the sort of the muscle behind the decisions that are made by the regulators. So Lakewood's position is that we have just submitted an updated plan that will get us to 96%. We're seeking the state of Ohio to be the primary regulator to give us more flexibility. And we're negotiating with the US EPA to take a back seat to the Ohio EPA. I think, Frank, you know in particular we've got some serious challenges towards
Right.
that. But we have the advantage of a brand new law that was signed into place in about January 15th of this year. And I've got it in front of me, if I can find it. House Representative Bill 7279 was passed almost with unanimous consent by both houses, which recognizes the need for integrated planning for cities like Lakewood to be flexible and adaptable. So we're on the front lines. We're almost the first city into the chute arguing this new federal law using the strength of Ohio EPA and their abilities to change some paradigms that have been in place for a very long time. So that's the drama of Lakewood's position at this point. And I would like to acknowledge that Lou McMahon, who's in the audience, Lakewood resident, is our attorney, is an authority on these subjects, and we're very fortunate. And we're going to be traveling to Washington in the next couple of weeks to carry this message. So I think my view is how you navigate these. There's the technical piece, the financial piece, and then there's the political and regulatory piece. And I think you've got it covered between the three of us here.
Yeah, I want to get back to the regulatory piece, and I also want to get back to the issue of who pays. But in order to get to those questions, I guess I want to ask a prior question, which is, and it's been alluded to, but if we could elaborate a little bit more, if we don't do anything, or if we had not done anything, what are the consequences? Because it's very easy for someone, particularly now that you get your monthly bills rather than your quarterly bills, and you say to yourself, well, why are we paying for this? Why did the government force us to do this? How can we maneuver this? So if we can just take a step back and try to understand what the consequences are of not doing anything. And I'll look to you, Frank, first.
Well, the Cuyahoga River burned 13 times. 13 times over 100 years. That was in part the consequence of not doing a whole lot, right? In terms of environmental regulations and control. And no one loves regulations, but they're absolutely necessary in many circumstances to create action. So you look, we live on the Great Lakes. Our greatest asset is Lake Erie, both from a water supply standpoint and a recreation standpoint. There's nothing better than being on the Great Lakes, in my opinion. Now, we can allow that Great Lake to die. Remember the jokes in the 60s? You remember? I remember. Mistake on the lake, right? The lake is dead and the river is burning. So that's the price of inaction, and that's a big price to pay in terms of a large economy and driving your economy forward in terms of jobs, retaining people, and providing a great quality of life. So we face this again. Combined sewer overflows are part of it. They're very expensive. We have to implement reasonable solutions to make reasonable progress. But if you like to recreate in these water bodies, bacteria is an issue. So you've got to do the right things on different sources, not just combined sewer overflows, to allow that dream to become somewhat of a reality or get more time in terms of recreation. The algae issue on Lake Erie, to me, is the burning river of the last 100 years. So it's another very powerful, tough challenge. It's driven through phosphorus and rain and sediments and agricultural runoff and other sources. So the price of doing nothing, particularly with that major issue in the Western Basin, the price of doing nothing to solve that problem is drying up the economy of the Western Basin from July till October. And that's a $1 billion, that's a $10 billion price tag on an annual basis. And the price of doing nothing is creating public health problems, both in the water bodies or in the water you drink. The greatest advance in public health protection was sewers and wastewater treatment plants. So if you want to ignore them through lack of investment, you're going to pay the price.
Do either of the other?
I think Frank pretty much said it all. The stories just abound. And recently, if you're looking at the issue in Toledo, when it was summertime a couple of years ago, and they could not use the water, drinking water, and it's just unbelievable, because water is life. I mean, you need it. It's essential. And to think that you can't turn on your tap, we are so used to that. Imagine if this summer we couldn't turn our water on. But it is of recreation. People, if you saw the pictures of Lake Erie, then where people were, dipping their hand and it was coming out coated in green algae. Boat captains at their businesses, they couldn't run their business because there's so much algae. It got sucked into the engine, and the engines just went kaput. So it is a big economic cost if we don't do anything, and it's the cost of living. And I've said to the farmers up in Northwest Ohio, it's a cost of doing business for them too. That they have a responsibility. We all do, for doing our part to keep that water clean for the many benefits that it has. And if not for recreation, for our health, for drinking water, for our food and safety, that type of thing.
I think there's probably a fair number of people in this audience who grew up in Cleveland, and if you think back, the fact that almost nothing happened on the river except industry. The only time we referred to the river was when we were talking about east side versus west side, but no one ever talked about it in terms of, I'm going down to the river to boat or kayak or whatever. And the same thing with the lake. I remember as a kid being on someone's boat, and I actually swam in Lake Erie and then joked about it with my friends that I swam in Lake Erie and lived to tell about it. So back then, obviously things were very different, and the amenities that people feel are necessary to attract people to Northeast Ohio. We're obviously competing with every region in the country to attract the best and the brightest and to keep the people who have grown up here and want to stay here. The mayor talked a little bit about the potential change in how this is going to be controlled, moving from the original consent decree to possibly a situation where the state, rather than the US EPA, would be the primary regulator. Could you talk a little bit more about that, Mayor, and then anyone else who wants to address that?
The tradition has been this federal authority with Federal Department of Justice with a lawsuit against an agency such as a city or a sewer district. And then some agreement is reached that can result in a decree that's overseen by a federal judge. That's been the case for about 50 years. The challenge with that approach is that it becomes very rigid. And as technology and circumstances and moving Mother Nature, there's a lot of variables that are shifting around here. You can use your common sense and experience to know it's not a stagnant situation we're dealing with. That those consent decrees do not provide the flexibility necessary to adapt. In the course of the 50 years, if you were under a consent decree, you might have had 2 or 3 recessions hit your town. The Great Recessions knocked the stuffings out of a lot of cities. So what was a reasonable 20-year plan in year 1, by year 10 in the middle of a Great Recession is not remotely affordable in terms, and therefore needs to be adjusted. Those circumstances were not well tolerated by the rigidity of a federal decree. U.S. Congress unanimously understood that and has given a very clear signal that there needs to be flexibility. You need to recognize other obligations that cities have with their scarce resources. We have water distribution issues, drinking water. We have street surface issues. We have schools to maintain in our community and fund. There's a variety of competing needs for those dollars to maintain the viability of a neighborhood. And U.S. Congress recognized that that has to be part of the consideration when you figure out the long-term commitments that are there. It's a fantastic breakthrough. We now have to educate all the regulators that, hey, folks, there's a new law, and we're going to show you what we think it means, and we're going to be discussing the differences. And I presume, Frank, you're trying to understand how you can undo some things on the consent decree. Fortunately for Lakewood, we are not under such a consent decree. We are on administrative orders. So we are in the very fortunate circumstance not to have to undo something in order to redo this new law as it's intended to be. So that's why we're in a very significant leadership position on behalf of, I think, the country in some respects, to show how our needs, our timing, and our plan can be best reflected by this nimble approach.
Could you explain that a little bit more when you say that that Lakewood is not under a consent decree, but is under administrative order?
So there are 2 primary regulatory tools that the federal and state governments use. The state government uses a permit, and through that permit it gives you the permission to operate a wastewater treatment facility. That permit can describe exactly what you're supposed to do, investments you need to make, and outcomes you're supposed to achieve. That is the permit that Lakewood is seeking to strengthen as the primary tool. That can be a 5-year permit, it can be a 10-year permit, and that would allow for adaptation and recognition of changes. The federal government has this federal lawsuit with an agreed upon settlement that only can be changed by the judge, I think. You have that experience, Frank.
Right.
Fortunately, we do not. So Lakewood then has the permit as the primary regulator tool, and the U.S. EPA has agreed to take a back seat through administrative orders. They're watching very carefully. They're using Ohio's approach, and we have to report to them, but they're not stringent. So administrative orders are basically, we're watching, we're observing, we don't like, we're communicating both of those, and here's what we need to achieve, and we negotiate and discuss those. It's a much more informal approach, much more satisfactory, obviously.
I may be reading a little bit between the lines, but one of the questions that was submitted about whether it should be the feds or whether it should be the state, I think implicit, and perhaps something that people are wondering, does moving forward mean that either at the regional level or at the Lakewood level that we're looking to do less?
No.
That the idea is
No.
to get out of control from the feds, who in the past have been vociferous in what they have demanded of the region. And I'll ask Frank, and then I'll turn back to the mayor.
No, it's not a matter of doing less. There is a federal law, the Clean Water Act. The combined sewer overflow policy is codified in that act. There are clear outlines for what communities need to do to comply with the combined sewer overflow control policy. I'm highly biased, so I'll say some things and I'll try and control myself. I do think the states, should maintain primacy on these things. The states understand state and local issues. The more you integrate more players into the process, although all well-intentioned, I'm sure, it causes delays and differences of opinions in approach on that side of the negotiation. Our example is we submitted our plan in 2002. We were ready to build the Yucca Creek Tunnel in 2002. And then we talked for 8 years, I think it was. 8 years. Till we got to an agreement, because there are many players and many parties, and it's a huge issue. And in our case, it's $3 billion. $3 billion. So 8 years of delay. You know what occurred? The program escalated by $1 billion because of construction cost escalation. So that's bad business. I understand consent decrees, and in some cases they're necessary for truly recalcitrant folks. But in an instance where you've got a good sewer district, city of Lakewood or whoever, who have had a history of environmental enhancements, are the worst thing I think that can happen. And there is a permit mechanism, as the mayor alluded to. The integrated planning that was also codified in the Clean Water Act this year or late last year is a great step forward. It allows communities or sewer districts to understand their problems, but it doesn't mean we do less. It means we commit to things in phases. And there's another term, it's called adaptive management. Implement things, do things, make pretty big commitments, but implement and then find out what we've achieved and then move on to the appropriate next step. And that's best accomplished in a permitting scheme, in my opinion, and I really think that's the way things should go. I don't think it would minimize necessarily, it could minimize investment, but it maximizes your investment in the right areas to protect and enhance your community and the environment.
Yeah, I think I would just add, the problem with a federal view is they have a one-size-fits-all. They don't understand Lakewood. Lakewood is just another city on the map. And so they have a template, and they apply that template the same way to every city. And the circumstances in each city are different. And that's certainly true within the sewer district itself. So it makes no sense to have a one-size-fits-all and call that success. It looks good on paper. The federal regulators can say, they can check the box and say we've done our job. But they haven't done a thing if they, in fact, force us to do work that doesn't contribute to the success of our goals, if it makes the citizens of Lakewood so burdened that we can't afford to live here anymore, and snuffs the vitality of a community, and thus ruining the ability to finish the rest of the job. All those are the integration questions that are critical, that only are understood when someone takes the time to say, tell us about Lakewood, what's unique to your circumstance, and how can we make this work for you? They can hold us accountable through these permits. They can sue us. They can put us on consent decrees at any time. Our view, and I suspect the regional sewer district's view is the same like in any city, is Let us prove that we can do the job, and if we don't, if we become that recalcitrant city that Frank alluded to, then we deserve to perhaps to be, but we're not that city. And that's the approach, that's a philosophical position I think we take.
It's common sense approach. This is at like a whole different level, but just at kind of a sidebar that our sister agency is the federal USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, which was originally the Soil Conservation Service. You know, born out of the Dust Bowl, late 1930s. It didn't take too much time after that. So in the early 1940s, that people were already clamoring that they already wanted something more local. That, you know, we're talking 70 years plus 80 years ago, that even then people said, here's the federal government, they don't know who we are. They, you know, the same thing, where's the flexibility? We want to work with people that understand our particular circumstances. So it makes perfect sense, and I just love the idea, and I agree with Frank that that's one thing that our agency, because we're small, and we are a small government agency, been around for 70 years, that we do get to implement, and we get to try things and see what works, and working with so many different communities. Lakewood is very heavily, it's a dense community, a lot of impervious surface.
Population density.
Yeah,
not
population
intellectual.
density. Yeah, not dense, not mentally dense. But you know, the programs, the things that we can do in Lakewood, from, by the way, education, or if we're talking about the types of post-construction stormwater management, are going to be different in Lakewood than they are going to be in North Royalton. So that flexibility is really, really important. And at least in the permit, the permits that these 54 cities in Cuyahoga County are required to implement their programs, that there is that flexibility. The Ohio EPA kind of manages, oversees that permit process, and they do allow for that flexibility. So I like that. I like hearing about that. Yeah.
You just mentioned the issue of a couple people mentioned the issue of local. I'm wondering, as you know, in Cuyahoga County, we have lots of different governments. And whether that is a good or a bad thing is a topic for another night. Perhaps the League of Women Voters will sponsor a forum on that. But it strikes me that one of the issues that brings up, you have a Lakewood which is almost entirely built out, and therefore, even if there was the political will to control runoff or impervious surfaces better, there's not a lot that can be done, whereas there are other communities within the county and within Northeast Ohio where there would be other ways of controlling runoff if there were the political will and if someone could make them do that. And I use that term advisedly. How do we solve this problem on a regional level in a way that respects Lakewood, respects Strongsville, respects each local community, but at the same time takes into account the different ways in which we could be trying to control this, not just by digging pipes?
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to speak as a member of a regional authority. And we serve all or parts of 62 communities. So, and I don't think this exists as much in Lakewood. The intercommunity flows coming from outside of your community. You're pretty self-contained. But in many communities across Cuyahoga County, Summit, Lorain Lake, all of these communities, we have what we call intercommunity issues, both sanitary sewer or stormwater runoff, meaning the sanitary flows from Strongsville can then flow through Parma Heights and Parma on to Cleveland and then on to the sewer district treatment plant. So it keeps flowing from one community to the next. Certainly all of the streams carry flow from multiple communities. No stream that I know of in Northeast Ohio begins and ends in one community. So intercommunity is the key term. Now, to solve intercommunity problems, would mean you'd have to line up all those communities that are contributing to the problem, finding the best solution and location and getting them all to chip in at the same time. And we all know how that goes. It's impossible. It can happen, but it's very impossible. So we were created by a court action to do just that, to solve intercommunity drainage problems so we can look broadly, choose the right locations for the best solutions, and make sure those solutions, whether they're sanitary sewer, combined sewer, or stormwater runoff issues, don't solve the problem here and move it there. And you're right, there are different opportunities, different alternatives for solutions in different parts of the drainage system. When you get down closer to the lake, you don't have a lot of open space in many areas, right? So if you've got a lot of erosion, you can't create floodplain in some of these areas, so more hardened engineering solutions are necessary to armor those banks and keep those streams from beating them up. But at the same time, I can do things in the upper portions of the watershed through implementation of different types of projects that can benefit those folks down in the urban core, and that's what we're looking to do. So you just have to be creative, but there's got to be revenue to do that, and you really have to plan out your program, invest in planning, develop your plan, and begin implementing and showing signs of success, monitor, and then proceeding with the next phase. There's got to be a plan. If I'm going to ask folks for money to do things, I have to have a plan and tell them what I'm going to do, and then go do it, and then show results so we move forward. And infrastructure management is hard stuff, but this is the stuff that has to happen, because we can't just say, hey, can't solve this problem because I'm in community X or Y.
Well, yes, go ahead.
Frank, so you're talking about a huge utility, right? I would guess you call it a utility, but an community drainage. So there are watershed organizations, and a watershed is an area of land that's drained by a particular stream. So a watershed could be as small as a little stream maybe going through your backyard. It could be as big as the Rocky River that is in 4 counties. We have multiple watersheds in Cuyahoga County, and all of Cuyahoga drains to Lake Erie, so we're all in the Lake Erie watershed. But there are watershed programs, and so those, going back to that kind of more local approach, because people do think locally. And most people, and I've done public involvement for a long time, that people, there are some, we have cars, we drive around, but people like to be involved in their own community. They have some ownership in that. So these watershed programs, and there's a lot of planning involved and fundraising and doing projects that, maybe help restore stream-side habitat and to reduce erosion and help with water quality. So there's some of that more localized, smaller kind of programs that work in conjunction and are in fact supported by the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, and that really helps us kind of meet those targets of bringing back the fish and reducing erosion. In a couple of the Rocky River watershed stream restoration programs, thousands of tons of sediment that was not ended up being saved or not washing off and eroding into the waterways, and that's huge. The Cuyahoga River has to be dredged every year to the tune it's a few $1 million, I think, something like 300,000 cubic yards of sediment pulled out, and right now there's the cost to dredge that sediment, but it's still deemed not safe enough for open lake dumping, so it has to be placed in confined disposal facilities. As somebody who works for the Soil and Water Conservation District, soil's a natural resource, just like water. So when I think about soil being kind of confined in what's tantamount to a dump, it seems to be a waste of natural resources. So if the soil can stay on the land, that's a huge benefit for all of us.
Frank brought up the issue of cost, so I'm going to first turn to the mayor to talk about what the plan is going forward for Lakewood and how that is going to be paid for, and then come back to Frank and ask what is projected in the next few years for the sewer district as a whole and how that is going to be paid for.
Well, fortunately for Lakewood, we can study many cities that have gone before us with these challenges. Historically, and up to this very moment in time, and likely for the next several years, we will fund these significant investments by charging users of our water system. So a gallon of water into your house gets charged a certain amount of money, and then its assumption is that that same gallon then leaves your house and goes into our sewer system, and that gets charged. And so we are committed to using rates of water in, water out as the primary source of funding for these tools. There is a limitation to that. Generally speaking, when a combined combination of drinking water costs and sewer costs exceed 4% of a household income, that becomes a high burden. So we are looking at the need to make these investments, and this is where the hard part comes in. Everybody who hears about our sewer challenges agrees with the goal. We talked about that a moment ago, about do we question the need for the regulation? The answer is yes, it's good regulation. The law is a fabulous law. We need to do this work on behalf of our stewardship to our environment. The problem is, how do we pay for it all? Richard Nixon actually vetoed the Clean Water Act. If you go to the Congressional Visitation Office before you go into the House of Representatives, the Capitol, I'm not sure it's still there, but they used to have the sample of the bill, the Clean Water Act, and they had all the markups on it. But he actually vetoed it, not because he disagreed with the bill, but because the cost of implementing it at that time was, I don't know, it was like $100 billion. This is 1972, mind you. And he said, well, there's no way we can afford this. But the House or the Congress overrode his veto, and it became law. Today, I imagine it's probably $10–15 trillion if we were to implement this thing in its full scope, and we would aspire to do it. So the challenge has never been the worthiness of it, but how do you pay for all this stuff? And then how's the engineering? How do you get that right? And so Lakewood has to be moderate here. We have to be very sensitive to the fact that by 2024, we estimate pretty close to 40% of our households will be at that burden threshold, which means there's a limit to what we can do. And that gets to the part of the flexibility here, so that if we hit this limit where 40% of our households are at about the 4% or more, we have to figure out alternative ways to fund this. And we may not be able to do that in the time frame that a federal judge might want or some regulator in Washington might desire. But we sure think about it. We think about those households. They are our neighbors. And so that's where the nimbleness has to be a factor of how we adjust to the reality of getting the job done, paying for it. Now, if the federal government aspires to give us significant grants, I think Frank and I would be in a different conversation. But thus far, they are not our financial partner. They are a regulator, and it's an unfunded mandate, one we agree with, but nevertheless, it's unfunded, and that is a limitation of communities like Lakewood.
Okay, in our situation, just give perspective on how we pay. In the first, I don't know how many, since up to 1990, I'd guess $3 billion plus about $3.5 billion of investment by the district in all the environmental enhancement we made, whether they were a treatment plant, combined sewer overflow, building new sewers, what have you. $650 million of that total was federal money, grant money, construction grants program. So that really helps when you're investing that much to get that much. Really helps to reduce the rate shock to your customers. And we did a nice job of cashing in and getting federal construction grant dollars to move things forward, but also to minimize the impact on our customers. That program died in 1990. And in the next $3 billion that have been invested since, the federal grant amount is essentially zero. So it changes the equation. Now we, like Lakewood, charge based on water usage. We've implemented, we develop rate scenarios in 5-year increments, get our Board of Trustees to adopt them. We're looking at what are the federal requirements, what are the building requirements in terms of repairing infrastructure, what's the need for the next 5 years, and then assign a rate. To give you perspective, and those rates back in the day were, I don't know, 4%, 5%, 6% annually. When we signed the consent decree in 2010, I think it was, or 11, the next 5-year increment was 13% rate hikes annually for 5 years. So that's 13% increase, another 13, another 30, you know, so it compounds. So very significant and very painful. And those rate hike hearings were very painful. But it was a direct result of needing to implement a federal court-ordered consent decree, and we bit the bullet and moved on. And most urban centers, Cincinnati and Columbus and Akron, have had similar scenarios. So regulations can drive rates many times. Now, the next 5-year increment, I think we were at 8.5 or 8.6% over, this is the 5-year current. I can't necessarily say what the absolute will be. We think they might be a little less than that over the next 5 years, but still 8% on an annual basis, that's a significant rate hike. So how we try to offset that, 2 ways. We are big players. We're always looking at the market. You can get bond financing, just like for your house. You can go get a loan from somebody, but you're paying interest. And so you've got to really look at that interest. You got to pay debt service. The bond market was very attractive for a while, and that's where we went. Ohio has a really nice state revolving loan program with very favorable repayment terms, and the interest is far lower than the bond market right now, so we're doing that. And that's just a prudent investment strategy because those interest rates are very low, and some are 0 interest rates for some of the combined sewer improvements, so we're a big player there. And this is big business because we're talking billions of dollars. So we're trying to find the best investment strategy. And because we know that's an impact on Cleveland's number, whatever, 2, 3, 4, 5 in poverty nationwide, we have a lot of users in poverty. And we've got, you know, an elderly community as well, some disadvantaged folks. So we have rate savings programs in place to help offset the cost for folks to minimize their sewer bills going forward.
How does our cost compare with other cities, both in Ohio and other cities that we might be competing for people or industry with? So first of all, on the household level, how does our cost compare? And also in terms of industry, I remember for years hearing that the fact that we are on Lake Erie would give this region a competitive advantage in terms of having fresh water. So can you address both parts of that question?
Well, the first part, how does our sewer fees and rates compare? Like I had indicated, Akron, Cincinnati, Columbus have all seen very high annual rate hikes to support primarily the construction of the combined sewer overflow components. So the district is probably in the upper tier nationally, not at the very upper edge, but I would say we're at midpoint or, you know, a little bit higher than that. All older urban cities, and that's not just it's Ohio, Midwest, Great Lakes states, Northeast, so you're talking Jersey and New York and those communities, in the upper Northwest, Seattle and Oregon communities all have combined sewer system. So when you look at the national rate surveys and you look at the combined sewer communities, they're going to be up there. They're going to be up there. Now, the flip side is the water resources and bringing people back. I'm a firm believer it's going to happen. And it's going to happen because of availability of water, but it's not going to happen if the infrastructure is decayed. And the infrastructure needs to support Renaissance, right? So you have to invest in your major infrastructure, roads, sewers, water. Because if you want to attract large industry, they need utilities and they need utility performance. So it's a long-term vision, I think. I think our major infrastructure, the regional infrastructure, is in fairly decent shape. We've got to keep it there. But the water, I think the availability of water, I went to a conference, been to a couple conferences, and I went to one in Albuquerque, New Mexico a couple months ago for the wastewater utilities. And you know, the whole discussion isn't about combined sewer overflows and wet weather. It's all about dry weather and no water. and how we're going to garner water and how we're going to ration water and what people can do in terms of watering lawns and flushing toilets. It's amazing stuff. I don't see how that's sustainable. Phoenix and Albuquerque and Tucson, these areas, I just don't know how it's going to be sustainable. So we have a resource. We've got liquid gold, and so somehow we've got to make it work because it can drive, and it's a worldwide problem. And when you lack water, you have big problems. We don't have that situation. We have other problems. So we've got to create a vision to take advantage of that resource and regrow this area. And I think it's going to happen, but we have to make very targeted steps and keep moving forward.
And I'd like to just affirm that. When at the U.S. Conference of Mayors meetings, of which Lakewood is a member and I attend, there's a national meeting in Washington each year, and there's a water council led by the mayor of Lime, Ohio, David Berger. He's a fabulous leader, and they've gone through significant struggles to deal with this very issue. But the room is bifurcated into two conversations, as Frank alluded to. Half of us are worried about our sewers. The other half are worried about drinking water. Mm-hmm. And it's important to understand that distinction. So for those of us on the sewer side of the concern, I think I would affirm that our rates are comparable to the region. We benchmark certainly Detroit, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, other cities like that, and we're in the range. But we do have a plentiful supply of drinking water, which is no small advantage. It's surprising to understand that states like Michigan, with as much water as they have a very antiquated water distribution system, drinking water. Flint, Michigan was sort of the poster child of many of the problems there. Indianapolis, a great city in the Midwest, has major limitations of drinking water in terms of where they get it and how they distribute it. So this water conversation is huge. We're talking about a major segment of it, probably half, but it is not going away. We can engineer and solve our sewer problems. If you're in Indianapolis, you cannot create water. If you're in the Southwest, you cannot create it. So we can, in fact, and expect to solve our problems here in this region. The engineering can do it. We need financial help. If you want to accelerate it, we'll get it done eventually. And in the meantime, we've got plenty of drinking water. That's no small advantage here.
Yeah. Which leads to real anecdotal, talking about the lack of water, and we're blessed with water. And they've been talking about transporting water out of the Great Lakes Basin for years. And it's all about where the population is and representation in Congress. Right now, we have laws that prohibit that, but just in Wisconsin, I think just a couple of years ago, there was a big discussion with the Great Lakes, about the, was it the water quality agreement? But they wanted to take the water over the compact, take the water outside of the Great Lakes watershed to help a community that was really in dire need of water. For those that are, Howard, you're an attorney, what happens? You set a precedent, and then the floodgates open, right? So that's something. But what Frank says, and what we started the conversation at the beginning, when you're talking about an investment, and yeah, it's an investment in our future. And if we want people to come back, we've lost population. In 1972, Cleveland's population was 750,000 people. We're down at under 400,000 people. If we want to be a great city in a region, we're going to have to make those investments, and we're going to have to make them sooner than later, because we want people to come here. We want that representation speaking for us to keep the water in our region. It is time. It's time to go from the Rust Belt to the Water Belt, and I think that requires no pain, no gain, and it's an investment in ourselves and our region.
So just a color commentary. I was at a U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting in Washington, and I happened to speak to two mayors, one from Sunnyvale, California, home of Apple or Google, and the other one was Cupertino, Apple or Google. I can't remember which is which. So I said, hey, geez, what are your primary concerns? Thinking, these are very wealthy communities. And they said, we have two major big problems, water and affordable housing. And I said, we have many problems in my city, not those two.
That's right.
Is the only way forward for Lakewood to have to invest lots and lots of money as the existing infrastructure gets older and older, and in the region to lay more and more pipes and build more and more retention basins? Or are there other ways, either technology or more dispersed land use control, that could make going forward less expensive than it otherwise looks like it will be?
Well, Bill Gates has offered a $24 million challenge to build the toilet of the future. Now, he has a worldview of basically this problem across the nation, across the world. I mean, there are many communities in third world countries in particular who discharge their waste right into the same water they're drinking, I mean, without any processing. In fact, my daughter is an urban planner in Nigeria, and that's exactly what she's trying to shift there. But the point is, technology is emerging in a fairly rapid way that allows these micro-processing capacities. I think about and dream about the house in Lakewood in its second century may look like its first century, but inside is a micro-processing waste management system that does several things: captures the waste, treats it, produces methane. The methane is captured, converted into energy, and it becomes a micro-energy cycle. And so all this massive historical 100-year-old view of building the collector system and the treatment system, where we collect it, we send it away, we gather it, treat it somewhere else, which is how state-of-the-art really, could in fact be challenged by and improved by new technology. That's why nimbleness is so important. If we were to sign a 20-year agreement or a 30-year agreement that locked us into the old orthodoxy, and Bill Gates wins his challenge, why wouldn't we want to introduce that as a major scale of investment for us? Let's say that toilet cost $8,000, and it probably will. But instead of investing that same $75 million in pipes and collection system, we spent that same $75 million to about 8,000 houses in Lakewood. We've solved a lot of potential issues. Now, I don't know that that technology exists today, but I have to believe it's not impossible with what the thinking that goes on today. So that's what we need to think on. We have the same orthodoxy that was built in 1910, 2030 is what drives our engineering today. At some point, we got to challenge that paradigm.
And I think we had the opportunity to go to Israel on a water mission and visit different businesses that are dealing from wastewater, desalination. They're like #1 in desalination. Technology using UV rays to get the contaminants out of the water. Really fascinating. And there's some of that. Same thing. We have Silicon Valley. We have those smart people here as well. So the technology, it's not that far behind. But it's always, the devil's always in the details. It's the cost. It's bringing it up and being able to manufacture it on a much grander scale, because that's where you get the economies of scale and it brings the prices down. But there's a lot of really neat things happening, and to hear about what's going on in cities like Lakewood, and to go and visit these other countries, and where there's a need that people get innovative. If you're kind of pressed against the wall, you're gonna sit there and figure out how you're gonna get yourself out of the corner. So I think we're going to see a lot more of those technologies as we move forward in the next few years.
Take a stab. Okay, you're always going to see new technologies. If you think about your own homes, right? The roof, right? When you roof, you can get 20-year shingles, you can get lifetime shingles, right? They didn't always exist that way. And even siding. I'm about to side the house, and the choices of materials and insulation values are enormous. They're much broader than they ever were. Same thing in the wastewater industry, both in terms of treatment technologies at plants and materials of construction for sewers. When we build tunnels, we're expecting 100+ years of service life, if not more. So you've got to look at those right technologies and materials to make sure we take a very long view of cost. The upfront cost is one cost, but that piece of pipe's in the ground for 100 years and you need to maintain it. You need to select the right balance of upfront cost to minimize long-term cost. So I see this evolving over time. On the stormwater side, what we're trying to do is reverse what happened because of laying of pavement, impervious surfaces. We created and built out like crazy and put developments on top of very small streams. And I mean on top of streams. And then we kept growing, and then that stream got a lot more water, and everyone likes waterfront property, right? But not when it's running through your basement and your first floor. And so that's a problem. So what we're trying to do is reverse that. And where you can remove impervious surface, do it. But where you can remove structures and recreate floodplains, streams want to flood. When it rains, they want to flood. The problem is they don't have the area to flood anymore because there's a road, a bridge, a building, a house. So we're always looking in our alternatives on stormwater management for acquisition or moving people or moving the stream to allow it to flood. That's a great long-term solution, because if you don't, you're going to be repairing that bank every 5 years. And on the long term, you're going to be spending much more. So we just have to be a lot smarter in the long-term investment, make good choices up front to save you a lot of money down the road.
And that just said, everything's connected in our world. And so these solutions, I mean, it really is a collaborative effort to figure out what's going to work best. In the city of Cleveland, so the Chevy branch of Big Creek, which runs from it's, south, it comes under the Chevy plant, flows north kind of through the Bel Air Puritas area. And during the recession, the housing crisis, that was an area kind of north of Puritas, south of I-71 that was hit really, really hard. And the stream went through there, and there's a small park. It's not a pocket park, but a little neighborhood park. And the stream kind of goes through. And the city of Cleveland actually did something that was pretty brilliant. Instead of when the houses were foreclosed on, and instead of like rebuilding a house there in a neighborhood that was already kind of stressed out, they took the homes down and they did recreate floodplain. And it just was amazing to see that not only did that stream have room to kind of fill up in the floodplain without overflowing into people's basements, but it also restored habitat. And then all of a sudden you see these animals and the ducks coming back in. So these things have benefits far beyond just us. From the smallest animals, when I talked about the bugs in the river, to the fish, to the birds, and then to us. So the benefits in that community of people not having to worry about backup flooding in their basement for a project that probably costs less overall than putting in pipes that, like Frank said, have to be maintained and you have to have a plan. But some other things that are pretty simple that we can do, things like green walls and planting trees, green walls, green roofs also capture water and help filter it and help keep the air clean and slow down the water and keep some of that water out of the system. Same thing with those post-constructions. The bioretention cells are meant to capture the water and have it slowly release into the system so you're not overtaxing the system. And we saw in the past couple days, the rains, how fast those rainstorms came down. And in May, I think we were, about 4 inches over on the average amount of rain that we usually get. I'm kind of shocked that we didn't get the usual calls from people saying, my backyard's flooded or, my house is ready to fall into the creek. But that was kind of weird for this year. But we've had a lot of rain, so anything that we can do to kind of slow it down, capture it, and help also filter out those pollutants, it's little actions that can be taken along and in combinations with the big, sewer system and those type of things.
At one time, as many of you know, this was referred to as the Forest City. And as we look at the tree canopy in Cleveland, it isn't what it used to be. There is now some talk being pushed by organizations like Thriving Communities and recently mentioned in the county's most recent annual State of the County address or whatever, to plant more trees. And, you know, the old line is, when is the best time to plant a tree? Yesterday. If we don't start planting trees now, in 20 and 30 years, they won't be there to control the runoff. I want to ask one more question and then try to get to some of the questions that have been submitted. We've answered some of these in the course of the discussion, but I want to ask a question that I remind everyone the camera is capturing this. Is there a fairness issue involved in all this? The city of Cleveland and the inner ring suburbs obviously have old infrastructure, and we've talked about that a little bit. Although all of Cuyahoga County is technically built out, there is still a lot of vacant land in the outer ring of Cuyahoga County, and there are things that those communities could do to control runoff, to require more permeable surfaces, et cetera, et cetera. There is no county authority that can tell them to do that. The sewer district can't tell them to do that. So is there a potential fairness or equity issue that the older parts of our county and our region are going to wind up paying more than other parts of the region who have more flexibility in what they could do to address this problem?
Hey, that's a loaded question.
And I'd be happy to start that conversation. Lakewood is an inner ring suburb. I had the privilege of chairing the First Ring Suburbs Consortium, which consists of 17 cities around. I chaired that group for 3 years. And so this was a very live conversation. And the narrative of inner ring suburbs across the country is the same. Fix it first. So the idea that our stuff was built earlier, it's older, and therefore needs to be reinvested in, should be a priority for the region. The exurbs, whose stuff was built post-World War II generally, is newer and generally have more space. Their turn will come. But and by the way, disproportionately in this region, that's where the wealth is. So the question is, how can we recognize the disparity of who has the money and who needs the money, and what's the fairness in terms of a rational investment from older to newer, which we think is a very rational conversation as first ring suburb folks. And by the way, this is first ring suburbs from Chicago, St. Louis, New York City, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh. It's the same problem. Baltimore, same problem. Our stuff is older. It needs a significant reinvestment. Before we spend more money to sprawl, which we have done liberally here in this region, we need to recognize that we need to take what few public dollars we have and make sure they don't enhance sprawl, but in fact circle back to reinvest in the fix-it-first concept. The urban core, by the nature of many federal policies, disproportionately get support. The inner ring suburbs, because they are suburbs, and don't recognize so many of the social justice issues historically that support the inner city, have been left out of many of these conversations. Many of us are arguing on how we need to maintain it. So the answer is, I don't have the solution of how we finance it, but one piece is should not spend a nickel of sprawl dollars until we fix the inner ring, which Mayor Lycan of Shaker Heights argued well as the connective tissue for the region. You cannot have a hollow inner ring. You cannot have basically failing inner ring suburbs, inner city or inner ring suburbs, and have a successful region. The exurbs, in particular, go through the inner ring suburbs to get to the inner city. Those suburbs on the inner ring have to be viable. And they're generally challenged with a shrinking tax base and this older infrastructure question and many other higher demands of human services, which conspire against their ability to make common sense investments. And that has to be recognized and then fixed. We've successfully in this region gotten NOACA, which takes about $50 million a year of federal transportation money and invests it over 5 counties. They now, through NOACA's formulas, recognize this fix-it-first concept. And they've also introduced a social justice piece to recognize the challenge of the households to fund those. And therefore, you can, as an inner ring suburb, score better as a consequence, and therefore compete more successfully for transportation dollars. That's a good step. And if there is a regional group to argue about infrastructure investment, NWACA serves that purpose today. Fortunately for Lakewood, Lakewood has a standing seat on that board. I consider that one of the most important responsibilities I have as mayor of this city, to not only speak on behalf of Lakewood, but also the inner suburbs of this region, to recognize what those things are. So that's a start, and there is a federal piece, so we can use those integration of federal transportation dollars then to look at what's going on underneath the road, and we are beginning to do that. But more has to be done. That takes enormous political will. I don't see that happening easily in the near term.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to give you the regional. This is a great question, because I've been posed this question a number of times across my career, and in different ways. I've had the outer ring suburbs complaining that all of the investment is going to be in the inner ring suburbs in Cleveland on this program. Now, the way the district was formed is the judge in 1972 assigned certain costs for certain projects to either the city of Cleveland or the suburban communities that were ongoing projects. And the suburban communities were going to pay for this, and the city was going to pay for that. But then for all other broad regional projects going forward, the judge's dream was that there was going to be a uniform regional rate for everyone. And we've been bringing together the suburban rate and the Cleveland rate together over time, and we make regional investments that all users are paying for. So there's two ways of looking at it. Some would say the combined sewer, $3 billion combined sewer overflow control program is being paid by all users of the district. The overflows are primarily in Cleveland and 7 inner ring suburbs. So you've got a group that would say, why are we paying for Cleveland's problem? Well, the judge didn't view it that way. The judge viewed the cleanup of Lake Erie and the streams as a broad regional issue that required broad regional investment. And I really think that was a brilliant ruling back then. Now, if you live in a suburban community, you might not think so. And certainly to pose a $3 billion program on the city of Cleveland, it wouldn't have happened. It would not have happened. So that's our dynamic. The stormwater program's another interesting thing. It's a uniform rate across all users. The problems are not just in the inner ring suburbs, they're also in the outer ring. The solutions in the outer ring bring some equity into the inner ring, because we've got to do things up there to prevent their transfer downstream. And certainly when we get to like Doan Brook and Rocky River, Cuyahoga River, those erosion and flooding problems are huge. So the project size is correspondingly much larger. And it's not just Cleveland paying for that, all users of the system, because of the way the judge set it up. And I think it's for us it works. It's a great solution. There's always been debate, depending on which side of the fence you're on, that we shouldn't pay for this or we shouldn't pay for that. But everyone pays for broad regional environmental investments because of broad regional benefit.
I'm going to try to go through some of the questions that we got submitted. Some of them have been answered in part, some of them haven't, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. What current programs are in place to assist renters or homeowners not only to use less water, but to reduce non-point source pollution?
I know you're ahead of us on that one, so go ahead, Frank.
Okay, for homeowners to reduce water consumption, well, obviously there's been a wave of all the fixtures are low flow, right? It used to be you could turn on a faucet and pressure would bring a ton of water to you. So there's been technological advances that do reduce water usage. We bill based on water usage. So you have to make prudent decisions about water usage. Are you overusing things? Are you, could you cut back in terms of water consumption? And what we've seen since I've been there is 2% declines in water consumption, almost on an annual basis, 1%, 2%. Some of it's the low flow, some of it's population drop, some of it people are using less water. There's no question about it. So you can control that to some extent on your property. I forgot what the second part of that.
The second part was also to reduce non-point source pollution.
Well, that's the dilemma of the ages.
Right.
You can control stuff on your property. So the Lake Erie algal issue is a nutrient-based issue. Phosphorus coming in the spring and early summer off of fields. Now in the Maumee, it's largely agricultural fields. Here, it's a mix of agricultural and municipal, urban. But phosphorus being introduced to the lake, there's too much phosphorus in the lake. If you have a garden and you fertilize, what happens when it warms up? The garden grows. That's exactly what's happening in Lake Erie. The Clean Water Act is not well equipped to handle it on the broad scale. We're trying to find ways to do it federally and local and with Ohio. What you can do, you're part of it too. Your stormwater runoff, depending on where you live, can go right to Lake Erie or an area stream. If you fertilize the lawn and you over-apply phosphorus-based fertilizers, you're part of it too. Now, Scott's Fertilizer and other people have taken it out. So there are steps, and way back in the day, in the 60s, when Lake Erie was blooming like crazy, they took phosphorus out of detergents. It was mandated. Calgon and others out. And we saw an instant change in Lake Erie. So there are things you can do locally.
And I
on
would
your
say that,
property to
I would say
manage.
that Lakewood anticipates that it will add a fixed component of its rate structure. And that would allow us to rebate or reduce fees based on homeowner investments, such as the green infrastructure that Janine talked about, that anything that would divert water out of the sewer system and into a bioswale in a yard. Significant efforts to separate at the household level sanitary from storm is an important investment. We think about 75 or a half our houses basically combine their storm and sewer at the household level. So getting household investments that separate at that level and or divert water out of the system is something we would want to encourage. And having a rate structure that provides incentives to do that is something we have to create.
A couple of questions about Lakewood. What happened to the proposed retention storage proposed for under Madison Avenue? And Lakewood has its own water system, wastewater system. Who else in Cuyahoga County runs their own system?
Yeah, well, North Olmsted runs their own water system. Rocky River, Bay Village, and Westlake have a combined sewer district. They run their own.
I think Euclid.
Euclid runs their own, that's correct. Boy, you would know better than I.
Okay, so North Royalton has 75% of their community served by a North Royalton treatment plant. Bedford and Bedford Heights have treatment plants. Now, we're talking Cuyahoga County, right? Euclid has a large treatment plant that services the eastern communities. I think Strongsville has 2 smaller plants that service their area. The rest, there were smaller plants that used to be operated by Middleburg Heights and Berea, Brook Park. We intercepted those with a sewer. Now we treat those. So we treat a large swath of Cuyahoga County, but Lakewood to the west, Euclid to the east are the real biggies on the periphery of us, and then those smaller plants.
And the storage tunnel under Madison is an engineering option, and it was explored significantly. The idea, there are 3 legs. You basically separate, and in terms of your strategy, you store and then treat later, or you expand your treatment capacity, assuming you can collect it all and get it to the plant. Those are the 3 major legs of the engineering triangle. So the tunnel under Madison was designed, as Euclid Creek is, to be a potential storage strategy. It was very expensive. Tunneling is very expensive. It's very disruptive. If you could imagine having an open shaft for a period of 2 or 3 years on Madison Avenue, blocking off significant portions, and then having basically construction along the way and then another shaft at the end of Madison Avenue, and what that would mean to transportation and the businesses on Madison, it would be incredibly disruptive. So what our engineering firms have created is an alternative, which is part of our proposal, which is 3 2-million-gallon surface tanks next to our current wastewater treatment facility, and we would build an aerial pipe from Riverside and Madison to divert that water down this pipe and into these storage tanks on these big rain events like we had today. So it would be a 6-million-gallon storage strategy that would be surface-based instead of underground. about a $25 million investment, a lot easier to build, a lot easier to scale and design, and we think is just as effective. So that's an example where you have paradigms of engineering solutions in densely populated communities, and you analyze those, and then there's an aha moment that says, wait a minute, let's think and challenge sort of the assumptions we're making here. Instead of creating the storage where the sewer is, maybe we can, in fact, transport the sewage to another storage site that makes more sense. And that's, in fact, what we were able to create, do the engineering for that, saving us a significant amount of money and disruption. And so as technologies emerge, that's where the nimbleness becomes really important. Because even if the technology exists today, but we don't think about it correctly, but as we bear down on a problem and become our pressure creates more inspirations, sometimes we'll see things differently, and we need the flexibility to be able to make those changes in the strategy. That's the heart and soul of the integrated plan that the new federal law encourages, that we're going to be arguing in Lakewood.
How does a resident determine if their city's wastewater treatment is acting green? Are there sources of public information out there about reviews that were done, findings, and corrective actions? So the general question of public information around this issue.
So Lakewood has all of our plans and discussions on our website. I know it's probably the most popular reading source in the city. But we also show on our website, and it'd be interesting to go today, we show discharge volumes and the outfall pipes. So you can go on our website, you can look and see what happened today, how much volume emerged and where. So bringing eyes and ears to our community to become aware of the problem, the nature of the problem, the size of it, and where it's located is an important element of citizen engagement. So the tools today are sharing all this information. Public meetings like this are very important. I wish there were more people here, but I think we understand it's not the most riveting subject, but it's probably the most important subject we have in the region.
There's a couple questions here that I guess I'll summarize as, in the recent past, is the situation getting better or worse? There's been times in the recent past where raw sewage has gone into our water source. There, at least according to one of the questions, there is algae turning up in the water that may not have, that we thought was under more control. Why are those things happening? Shouldn't this be a continuous improvement as opposed to a backsliding?
Okay, I'll answer. It's not Lakewood specific.
Right.
It's regional specific, and I'll focus on the Cuyahoga River because it is the 50th anniversary of the last time that river burned. And I will state unequivocally that Cuyahoga River's rebound is the national success story of the year. And we have the data to support it, and I love talking about it because I'm pretty proud of this. But, you know, that river was burning, right? Next to no fish in certain segments. In the 50s and 60s, maybe 20 fish species total in the best of sections and next to none in the worst. We're over 70 species today, many of them highly pollution intolerant. And the success story, it's been climbing, and we grab a new one every year, and we love when we see these things. And freshwater mussels are thriving now in the Cuyahoga River. They catch steelhead trout at the site where the last time the river burned, at that railroad trestle. People are sport fishing for rainbow trout, steelhead trout, so it doesn't get much better than that. I think the most iconic symbol of success is nesting bald eagles within a stone's throw of where that river burned in 1969. And those bald eagles left town 50 years ago because of DDT and everything else. And they were gone for 50 plus years, some approaching 100 years. And now we have a nesting pair of eagles in the industrial valley of the Cuyahoga River. It doesn't get any better than that. So there's been a significant movement forward locally, I think. Great rebound. But it came at a very big price, and it will take a lot of diligence going forward to maintain that. We cannot backslide. Lake Erie is an interesting dynamic. It changes. We had a huge, I'm old enough to remember the algal blooms of the 60s. Good Time 1. I remember going out with my grandmother. I'm like 10 years old. I remember the commentator. And to your right those are large mats of blue-green algae. This is the commentator for the Good Time 1, right? And they were these gigantic clouds. bad. Dead fish at the end of the East Ninth Street Pier, all kinds of stuff.
And the water, what it tasted like.
So, and the water, you know, well, algal blooms can cause taste and odor problems in the water. So it was a challenge for Cleveland Water. But we got past that, right? And there was a clean water, and there was a lot of investment, and things changed, and we changed. Phosphorus left detergents, sewer districts invested money, Lakewood invested money, you invested money. And so we saw great resurgence in Lake Erie, and the water quality had indeed improved. Now we're in another cycle. The lake's very dynamic. Temperatures are rising, precipitation changing. The whole balance is crazy again, and zebra mussels were introduced in the 80s. So it's going to take more investment. So you would say it's declining, and yeah, in the Western Basin, things are pretty bad. So we've got to get back to creating a situation where we can recover from that. There's always going to be a challenge, and it's always going to take investment to make sure that we keep going forward. So I think the things have really improved, but that algal problem, which is largely not our problem routinely, but can be our problem from time to time. We can get algal blooms, harmful algal blooms, small ones, at Edgewater or Euclid Beach. They've happened. But that algal problem is a big issue, and so we're going to have to figure it out.
And I would say one of the variables that slows us down, and I would agree with Frank, we're making progress, and we can demonstrate that by our own bacterial counts and testing and analysis. But Mother Nature's not our friend here. What used to be a 100-year storm is now a 50-year storm, or a 30-year storm, or a 10-year storm. So the frequency and the intensity of the amount of rainfall that we're having to address that creates the problem is a challenge for us. It's not a stable environment where it's like they keep moving, Mother Nature's moving the goalposts on us, and that makes it harder.
I think that's an optimistic note on which to end. So I want to thank everyone in the audience for your rapt attention to this incredibly gripping subject. And I want to thank the panelists for really giving us a very both wide and deep view of the issue that we were discussing tonight. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.